The sun was setting behind the hills, casting a golden glow over the small town. It was supposed to be just another calm evening, but for the twins, this evening would change everything. The day had started like any other. The twins, Emily and Jacob, were playing outside, laughing as they raced around their yard. They were just like any other kids, full of life and energy. But soon, their innocent fun would turn into a nightmare. It was late afternoon when their parents, who had been working in the garden, heard the sharp screech of tires. The noise cut through the air like a knife. A car, out of control, sped down the street, heading straight toward the twins, who were still playing in the yard. It all happened so quickly, Emily and Jacob didn't have time to react. The car swerved, its tires screeching loudly, and crashed into the fence, knocking it over like it was made of paper. In a split second, the children were pinned, unable to move as the wrecked car came to a stop, its engine sputtering in the background. Their parents screamed, helpless to get to them in time. For those few moments, everything seemed still, frozen in time. The world outside the chaos was nothing but a blur. Emily and Jacob's faces showed nothing but fear, their bodies trapped beneath the twisted wreckage. Their parents rushed forward, but they were too far to do anything. They screamed for help, but the chances of anyone reaching them in time seemed impossible. Just then, from across the street, a figure appeared in the distance. It was a man who had been walking home from his shift at the nearby factory. He heard the commotion, the cries for help, and without thinking, he sprinted toward the scene. This man wasn't anyone special, just an ordinary person who lived in the town. But in that moment, he became something extraordinary. His heart raced as he saw the twins trapped, panic in their eyes. The man didn't hesitate. Without a second thought, he dashed straight toward the wreck. The sight of the wrecked car, with its sharp metal parts scattered, could have been enough to stop anyone in their tracks. But not him. He moved with purpose, his hands working quickly but carefully as he managed to pull one of the children free. The car was dangerously unstable, shifting slightly with every movement, but the man, determined to save the twins, continued to work relentlessly. It wasn't easy, and at any moment, more debris could have fallen, but he pushed forward, his fear of the danger around him overshadowed by the desperate need to help. Minutes felt like hours, but eventually, after what seemed like an eternity, the twins were both freed. They were bruised and shaken, but they were alive. The man helped them to their feet, his hand steady, despite the chaos. The twins' parents arrived moments later, tears in their eyes, thanking the man over and over. The man didn't expect a grand thank you. He didn't want recognition. To him, he was just doing what anyone else would have done in his place. But for Emily and Jacob, he had given them a chance to live when they might have lost everything. Their world, which had seemed so safe just moments before, had been turned upside down. And it was all because of a man who had simply chosen to act when it mattered the most. That day, the twins didn't just get a second chance at life. They were given a hero, a true hero who didn't need a cape or title. He was a simple man, but in their eyes, he would forever be something extraordinary. After the accident, life slowly started to return to normal for Emily and Jacob. They were both in the hospital for a while, recovering from the physical injuries they'd sustained, but their mental wounds ran deeper. They often lay awake at night, thinking about how close they had come to losing everything. They would never forget the face of the man who had saved them. The twins' parents, who were also shaken by the accident, wanted to thank the man who had rushed to their children's aid. They knew that words alone would never be enough. But as much as they tried to find out who the hero was, the man had simply disappeared. He hadn't stuck around to accept praise or recognition. He had done what anyone with a heart would do in the moment. He saved their children, and then he quietly went on with his life. It took weeks of searching before Emily and Jacob's parents finally tracked him down. The man's name was Tom, and he lived a few blocks away in a modest home. He was a factory worker, a man who worked hard every day to provide for his family. There was nothing extraordinary about him. He didn't have any fancy degrees or special talents. He wasn't known in town for anything, except for the fact that he had acted selflessly when he saw two children in danger. When Emily and Jacob's parents knocked on Tom's door, they were nervous. What would he think? Would he be surprised to hear from them after all this time? But when Tom opened the door, he welcomed them with a warm smile, completely unaware of what they had come to say. The parents explained who they were, and Tom instantly remembered the day he had saved the twins. His smile faded slightly as he recalled the chaos of that moment, but there was no sign of pride or arrogance in his face. He seemed almost uncomfortable with the attention. Brushing off their thanks. "It was nothing," he said simply. "I just did what needed to be done." To Tom, it hadn't felt like a heroic act at all. It had felt like something anyone would do for someone in need. But to Emily and Jacob, what he had done was nothing short of miraculous. He had taken a huge risk to pull them out of harm's way, without even thinking about his own safety. Over the following weeks, the twins and their parents tried to reach out to Tom, but he always seemed to shy away from attention. He didn't want any recognition or gifts. He had made it clear that he was just an ordinary man who did what needed to be done, but he still couldn't fully understand the impact his actions had on their lives. Tom continued with his life, just as he had before the accident. He worked at the factory, spent time with his family, and kept to himself. Yet, despite his quiet nature, something had shifted in the small town. The twins' parents, and eventually the entire town, began to look at him differently. They began to understand that true heroes don't need applause or grand gestures. Sometimes, they are just ordinary people who make extraordinary choices when the moment calls for it. And for that, they were forever grateful. Even though Tom had no idea of the full extent of his influence, he had given Emily and Jacob a second chance at life, something they would never forget. As the years went by, Emily and Jacob carried the memory of that day with them. It wasn't something they spoke about often, but it was always there in the background, shaping who they were. They had been given a second chance at life, and they both knew it. The experience had affected them in ways they couldn't fully explain, but they also knew that they would never forget the man who saved them. Growing up, the twins developed a strong bond with each other. They shared everything: dreams, fears, and even the unspoken understanding that they had both been saved by a man who never expected anything in return. Emily, the more outspoken of the two, often talked about how they owed everything to Tom. Jacob, on the other hand, was quieter, more reflective. He often found himself wondering what their lives would have been like if Tom had never intervened that day. As they reached adulthood, both twins went their separate ways. Emily pursued a career in medicine, driven by a desire to help others the way she had been helped all those years ago. She became a nurse, working tirelessly in the emergency room, where she often found herself thinking about Tom and how he had saved her life without hesitation. She believed that his bravery had shaped her decision to work in healthcare, wanting to make a difference in people's lives just as he had made a difference in hers. Jacob, on the other hand, chose a different path. He became an engineer, always fascinated by how things worked and how he could make them better. Yet, even in his technical world, the memory of that day lingered. He often thought about how Tom's quick thinking had saved him and his sister, and he wanted to somehow honor that sacrifice. He knew that, like Emily, his life had been shaped by Tom's actions, even if they hadn't met again since that day. Despite their different paths, both Emily and Jacob shared the same feeling deep down. They wanted to express their gratitude to Tom. They often spoke about finding him again, just to thank him properly, but life always seemed to get in the way. It was hard to know where to begin searching for someone who had been so humble, so unwilling to accept recognition. After all, Tom had never asked for anything. He had just done what anyone with a heart would do. But the idea never left them. They both felt that it was important, no, necessary, to find him and let him know how much he meant to them. They owed him so much. It wasn't just about being saved from an accident that day. It was about the life that came after, the choices they made, the paths they followed. It was about realizing that a simple act of kindness had a ripple effect, changing the course of their entire lives. Finally, after years of thinking about it, Emily and Jacob made the decision to actively search for Tom. They felt it was time to show him that his actions hadn't been forgotten. They knew it wouldn't be easy, but they were determined to find the man who had saved them and let him know how much he had impacted their lives. It was a journey they both knew they had to take, no matter how long it might take or how hard it might be. It was their chance to honor the true hero who had silently and humbly shaped their futures. Years passed, and life continued to unfold for both Emily and Jacob. They had settled into their adult lives, each following a path shaped by the day Tom saved them. But the thought of finding him and expressing their gratitude never faded. It lingered in their minds, a quiet but constant reminder that there was something unfinished, something they needed to do. Tom, however, had slipped away from the spotlight, back into his simple life, just as he had wanted. Despite the praise he had received that day, he remained humble, never looking for recognition. To him, what he did was simply the right thing to do. In the years that followed, he carried on with his daily routine, working hard at the factory, spending time with his family, and living a quiet, unremarkable life. He didn't crave attention or accolades. His world was small, but it was enough. He had no idea how deeply his actions had impacted the lives of Emily and Jacob, or how they were still thinking of him after all these years. Tom had always believed that life was about doing the right thing when it mattered, and that was what he had done. He didn't need anything in return. It wasn't about the thanks or recognition. It was about making sure the children were safe, and that's how he lived his life. But even so, a part of him sometimes wondered if anyone ever thought about him, if anyone ever remembered. The years had gone by, and he was just another face in the crowd. For Emily and Jacob, though, it was a different story. They had grown up with the awareness that their lives had been saved by a man who didn't even know them. It had shaped their decisions, their views on life, and their drive to help others. Emily, with her caring nature, had always wanted to be in a position where she could help those in need, much like Tom had helped her. Jacob, too, had a desire to make a difference, to create things that could change the world for the better. But what stayed with them more than anything was the lesson Tom had unknowingly taught them, that sometimes the smallest actions have the biggest impact. And so, Emily and Jacob decided that it was time to find Tom. They began their search, unsure of how difficult it might be. They knew his name, but little else. The town had changed over the years, and many of the people who had witnessed Tom's heroic act were no longer around. They asked around, visiting old neighbors, contacting local businesses, but no one seemed to have any concrete information about where Tom had gone. Still, they didn't give up. The sense of gratitude they felt was too strong to let go. It took a lot of time, a lot of dead ends, and many visits to the town's old streets, but eventually they found out where he had moved. The small, humble house where Tom lived was tucked away in a quiet neighborhood, one that was now slightly overgrown with vines and trees. Emily and Jacob, both excited and nervous, stood in front of the house, staring at the door they hoped would open to a long-awaited reunion. They didn't know what to expect when they met him again. Would he remember them? Would he be surprised to see them after so many years? They both wondered what Tom had been up to all this time, and whether he would feel awkward or embarrassed about the praise they were about to give him. But one thing was certain. They couldn't leave without telling him how much his simple, selfless act had meant to them. It had changed the course of their lives, and no matter how many years had passed, that was something that would never be forgotten. With hearts full of hope and anticipation, they knocked on Tom's door. What would happen next? Neither of them knew, but they were determined to find out. The door creaked open slowly, and there stood Tom, looking older, but still the same. His weathered face broke into a smile when he saw Emily and Jacob standing on his doorstep, though he didn't immediately recognize them. They had both grown so much since that fateful day, and the years had shaped them into adults. But despite the changes, the connection between them was unmistakable. "Can I help you?" Tom asked, his voice calm but curious. He seemed unsure, a little taken aback, as if he wasn't used to visitors, especially ones that seemed so familiar, but from a time long past. Emily took a deep breath before stepping forward. "Tom, we don't mean to surprise you. We're Emily and Jacob. Do you remember us?" Her voice trembled a little as she spoke, her heart pounding in her chest. She wasn't sure what to expect, but the thought of finally standing in front of the man who had saved them all those years ago brought back a flood of emotions. Tom's brow furrowed for a moment as he looked at their faces, trying to make the connection. Then, suddenly, it clicked. His eyes widened with recognition, and he took a step back, his expression softening. "Oh my goodness, you too," he exclaimed. "I didn't even realize. I thought about you both over the years, but I didn't know." His words trailed off as he stepped outside, looking at them more closely. It was clear that he was just as shocked to see them as they were to find him. "We've been looking for you for so long," Jacob said, his voice filled with emotion. "We needed to find you, Tom. We wanted to thank you properly." Tom shook his head, almost as if he couldn't understand why they were here. "Thank me? What for?" He seemed genuinely puzzled. "I didn't do anything special. I just helped when I could." Emily smiled, her eyes a little misty. "No, Tom. What you did that day, it changed everything for us. You saved our lives, and we've never forgotten it." She paused, trying to find the words to explain how deeply his actions had shaped the course of their lives. "You gave us a chance to live, to do everything we've done. We owe you so much, and we need you to know that." Tom stood there, speechless for a moment, as the weight of their words began to sink in. He had never thought of himself as a hero. To him, it had been a simple choice, doing what needed to be done. But as he looked at the twins, now grown and standing before him, he began to understand the gravity of that moment from so long ago. The conversation flowed easily after that, as the three of them sat in Tom's living room, catching up on everything that had happened since that day. Tom learned about Emily's career in medicine and Jacob's work as an engineer. He listened in awe as they shared how much his actions had inspired them both to help others, to live with the same sense of selflessness that he had shown. As the conversation continued, Tom could hardly believe what he was hearing. He had never imagined that his small, split-second decision to help two frightened children could have such a lasting impact. He wasn't just a man who had saved lives that day. He was a man whose actions had influenced two people in ways he couldn't have anticipated. He had unknowingly set them on paths of compassion, hard work, and a deep desire to make the world a better place. By the time the evening drew to a close, Tom's heart was full. The gratitude he saw in Emily and Jacob's eyes touched him deeply. But it was more than that. It was the realization that sometimes the simplest actions had the most profound effects. He hadn't needed to be a celebrated hero. He had just needed to do what was right. And that, as it turned out, was enough. The visit ended with promises to stay in touch. Tom was still humble, still unsure of how to accept the thanks being given to him, but Emily and Jacob made sure he understood just how much they appreciated him. They left his house that evening with full hearts, knowing that they had finally done what they had set out to do: thank the man who had saved their lives, and show him the incredible impact he had made. As they drove away, Emily and Jacob exchanged glances, both of them silently grateful that they had finally found their hero. And for Tom, a quiet man who had simply done the right thing, the recognition felt like a long overdue gift, one he never expected but would treasure forever. The evening after their reunion, Emily and Jacob couldn't stop talking about their visit to Tom's house. As they drove back to their respective homes, they reflected on how surreal the entire experience had been. The conversation had been so easy, as if no time had passed at all, and yet so much had changed. They had gone there to thank him, to tell him how much he meant to them. But in the end, it felt like they had received more than they had given. For the first time in years, Emily felt truly at peace. She had carried the weight of that unspoken gratitude for so long, and now, at last, it was acknowledged. Tom had never seen himself as a hero, and even now, after everything, he seemed uncomfortable with the praise. But Emily and Jacob both knew that Tom's quiet humility was what made his actions so extraordinary. He wasn't seeking recognition. He had simply acted when it mattered most. And that, more than anything, was why he had such a lasting impact on their lives. The next few weeks flew by, but the memory of their time with Tom stayed with them. Emily continued her work at the hospital, and Jacob continued designing the projects he had always dreamed of. But both of them began to see the world a little differently. Every patient Emily treated, every engineering challenge Jacob faced, reminded them of the lessons Tom had unknowingly passed on. It wasn't just about helping others. It was about doing what's right, no matter the cost. It was about seeing a need and taking action without hesitation, even when the world around you is chaotic. Then something unexpected happened. A few months after their reunion, Emily received a call at the hospital. A woman on the other end of the line was frantic, telling her that her brother was involved in a serious accident. The details were unclear, but Emily's heart sank as she listened. The voice on the phone sounded desperate, and Emily could tell the situation was critical. Without thinking, she rushed to the emergency room, mentally preparing for what she might have to face. When she arrived, she was taken to the trauma bay where the patient was being treated. As she pushed through the doors, she froze. There, lying on the table, was none other than Tom. He had been in an accident. Something serious, but not life-threatening. The sight of him, injured and unconscious, immediately struck a chord with her. After everything he had done for her and Jacob, she had never imagined she would be the one to help him in return. The emergency team worked quickly, and Emily joined them without hesitation. She called out orders, directing her team, doing everything she had been trained to do. The moment was surreal. Here she was, just as she had always wanted to be, a caregiver, a healer, standing beside the man who had saved her life years ago. As she worked, she kept glancing at his face, hoping he would wake up soon, hoping that he would know that it was her, someone he had helped, someone he had changed forever, helping him now. As the hours passed, Tom stabilized, and soon after, he regained consciousness. He was disoriented but alive, his eyes slowly opening to see the familiar face of the woman he had once saved. Emily was standing by his side, a reassuring smile on her face as she held his hand. "I guess it's my turn to thank you," she said softly, the words flowing naturally. Tom looked at her, confusion still in his eyes, but as recognition set in, his face softened. He gave a weak smile, clearly overwhelmed by the turn of events. "You've been there for me all along," Emily said, her voice thick with emotion. "And now, I'm here for you, just like you were there when I needed you most." Tom's eyes filled with gratitude, and for the first time, he seemed to understand the full impact of his actions. It wasn't just about saving 2 lives that day. It was about the connection he had formed with these people, a bond that had lasted through the years, a bond that no accident, no distance, could break. As Tom drifted back to sleep, safe and cared for, Emily realized something important. Sometimes, when you help someone, you don't realize the ripples that spread out beyond that one moment. The impact of one good deed, no matter how small, can echo through time, shaping lives in ways you might never expect. And now, it was their turn to repay him. Tom's recovery was slow but steady. The accident had been serious enough to keep him in the hospital for several weeks, but Emily's dedication and the care of her team ensured that he was well taken care of. As the days passed, he grew stronger, and Emily visited him as often as she could, making sure he had everything he needed. But it was more than just physical recovery. There was a deep emotional shift happening between them, something they hadn't expected. It was during one of these visits that Tom finally spoke about what had been on his mind. One evening, as Emily was adjusting his IV line, He turned to her with a tired but sincere expression. "You don't have to keep coming," he said quietly, almost apologetically. "I didn't expect this much attention, especially from you, Emily. You've already done so much for me." Emily smiled, sitting down next to his bed. "Tom, you don't get it, do you? You saved my life. You saved both of us. We owe you more than you'll ever know. And if I can do anything for you now, I'm happy to do it." Tom looked at her with a mixture of confusion and gratitude. "I just did what anyone would do," he murmured. "It was nothing special." Emily shook her head gently. "It was everything to us. You didn't have to do it. You risked your own safety for us. That's what makes it special." The conversation hung in the air for a moment, as if Tom were trying to process the weight of her words. He had spent his whole life believing that he was just an ordinary man, that his actions were just part of what anyone might do in a similar situation. But sitting there with Emily, hearing her speak so openly about the difference he had made, he began to understand the gravity of what he had done all those years ago. For the first time, Tom allowed himself to believe that he was more than just an ordinary man. He had been a hero, not because of anything grand he had done, but because he had acted when it mattered most. He had chosen to be brave, to step into the unknown, to make a life-or-death decision on behalf of two children who had no one else to turn to. As the weeks passed, Emily noticed something else about Tom. He wasn't just grateful for the care he was receiving. He was changed. The quiet, humble man who had once avoided recognition was starting to open up, starting to see himself in a different light. Emily could see the shift in his eyes, the way he carried himself with a little more confidence. He still didn't want to be celebrated, but it was as if he finally understood the true impact of his actions. It was around this time that Jacob called Emily with some exciting news. The engineering company Jacob worked for had decided to honor Tom in a way that no one had expected. They had planned a small private ceremony to celebrate Tom's bravery and the incredible impact he had had on their lives. The ceremony would take place at the company's headquarters, with a few close friends and family members in attendance. Emily was thrilled to hear the news and immediately shared it with Tom. At first, Tom was hesitant. He didn't want any kind of public attention. He didn't want to be in the spotlight. But Emily assured him that it wasn't about making him famous. It was about acknowledging the person he was and the difference he had made in their lives. "I'm not asking you to be anything you're not," Emily said, her voice warm and understanding. "This is just a way for us to show you that what you did really matters. You don't have to accept anything if you don't want to. But I think you deserve to know just how much you mean to us." Tom was quiet for a long moment. He glanced at Emily, searching her face for any sign that she was pushing him into something he wasn't comfortable with. But when he saw the sincerity in her eyes, he knew she wasn't asking for anything selfish. It wasn't about pride. It was about gratitude. And for the first time in his life, Tom felt it. The genuine, heartfelt gratitude of those whose lives he had changed forever. Tom finally agreed to attend the ceremony, though he kept telling himself he was only going because of Emily's insistence. Still, a part of him felt something he had never felt before, a quiet pride in the life he had lived, in the choices he had made. It was a pride not of ego, but of understanding. He had made a difference in the world, no matter how small or quiet that difference had seemed. As the ceremony day approached, Emily and Jacob prepared to honor the man who had saved their lives. They couldn't wait to see Tom, finally understanding that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness could have the biggest impact. And for Tom, it was the beginning of a new chapter, one where he could finally accept the recognition he had never sought, but certainly deserved. The day of the ceremony arrived, and the small venue was filled with people who had gathered to honor Tom. Emily and Jacob had spent weeks organizing the event, ensuring that it would be a moment that Tom would never forget. Though it was a modest gathering, the room was filled with warmth, and everyone present knew that this was a special occasion, a celebration of a life-saving act that had touched many hearts. Tom arrived, still a bit unsure about all the attention. His hands were slightly trembling, not from fear, but from the overwhelming realization that for once, he was the one being celebrated. He had never been one to seek the spotlight. Yet here he was, surrounded by people who had gathered to recognize the quiet heroism he had shown years ago. Emily greeted him with a warm hug, and Jacob gave him a reassuring smile. Tom could see the pride in their eyes, and it made him feel something he hadn't allowed himself to feel before: worthy. Though he still couldn't fully understand the extent of the impact he had had, he was beginning to see the difference he had made in their lives. The ceremony began with a short speech from Jacob, who spoke about Tom's courage, how a single act of bravery had set the course for the twins' entire future. He told everyone how Emily had been inspired to pursue a career in medicine, how she had dedicated her life to helping others, much like Tom had helped her. Jacob spoke of his own journey, how he had become an engineer, always motivated by the same sense of responsibility that Tom had demonstrated that day. As Jacob spoke, Tom sat quietly, listening to every word, feeling the mixture of emotions. He had never imagined that his actions would lead to such a ripple effect. He had never expected that a simple act of kindness would have such a lasting impact on the lives of two children he had barely known. But now, hearing Jacob's words, he began to understand. It wasn't just about saving two lives. It was about setting the foundation for everything that followed. Emily also shared her thoughts, recounting the day Tom had saved them and how, even after all these years, they had never stopped thinking about him. She spoke about the lasting gratitude she felt, about how Tom had unknowingly shaped her life, and Jacob's in ways they could never have predicted. Her voice wavered slightly, but she spoke with conviction. "Tom," she said, "you have no idea how much you changed our lives. The courage you showed that day, it shaped everything we've done since. You gave us a chance to live, to pursue our dreams, and because of you, we are who we are today. We owe you more than words can say." Tom's eyes grew misty as he listened to her words. He had always thought that the right thing to do was just a matter of instinct, something anyone would do. But hearing Emily and Jacob speak, he realized that perhaps he had underestimated the true weight of his actions. They weren't just words of gratitude. They were a reflection of how one person's choices could change the course of so many lives. After the speeches, the room fell silent for a moment, and then a round of applause filled the space. It wasn't just polite applause. It was genuine, heartfelt recognition for a man who had never asked for anything in return. The people in that room understood what Tom had done and what it meant. They understood that sometimes a simple act of bravery could ripple through the years and affect so many lives in ways that couldn't be fully measured. Tom stood up, his face flushed, his heart full. He felt humbled by the recognition, but more than that, he felt something new: peace. For the first time in his life, he allowed himself to feel proud of what he had done. He had saved two lives, and in doing so, he had helped shape a future. It was a quiet, humble legacy, but it was one that would last. After the ceremony, the three of them spent hours talking and reminiscing about that fateful day, laughing and sharing memories. Tom still couldn't believe the impact he had made, but he was beginning to see the truth in their words. He wasn't just a man who had acted in the moment. He had become a symbol of courage, of selflessness, and of the power of simple human connection. As the night came to a close, Emily, Jacob, and Tom stood outside together, watching the stars above. The world felt a little smaller, a little more connected. The past, present, and future had all come together in that moment. And they knew that no matter what happened next, the bond they shared would never break. And for Tom, it wasn't just about being recognized. It was about knowing that, in some small way, he had made the world a better place. A quiet hero, with no need for fame or accolades, had touched the lives of two people in a way that no one else could ever do. And that was enough.